All right, so good evening. Thanks to those of you who are taking the time to join. I appreciate it. And those of you watching later, I appreciate it as well. Welcome to our week 9 of global conflict and cooperation. So this workshop, recall, is about defining and exploring and discussing global conflict and cooperation from the point of view of different international institutions, country governments, and or international non-governmental organizations. And so for the past 8 weeks, we've focused on particular countries and particular regions of the world. So we looked at Afghanistan, Haiti, El Salvador, and Guinea in the first month. And then the second month, we looked at the Pacific region for 2 weeks and then the Atlantic region for 2 weeks. What I have planned, at least for the first 2 weeks of this second half of the fall semester, is the Americas part 1 and 2, and then to be determined the other ones. I haven't figured it out yet. And if you're interested, you can also watch the summer 2012 recordings that give a more conceptual overview of global conflict and cooperation, like, what is regional conflict and cooperation? How do we operationalize these ideas or bring them into the real world? And then different topics that are covered, like Afghanistan, the country of Eritrea, climate change, and bilateralism. So let's go ahead and jump to week 9, or for those of you who are joining in your second 8-week session courses, week 1, but I stay with the sequencing over the semester. Okay, so this is week 9, the Americas, and this is a Google Earth snapshot of the Americas with obviously North America here, Central America chilling, and then South America here doing its thing. So our learning objectives with this workshop are first to define the Americas region. Secondly is to describe an example of conflict in the region. And then next is to describe an example of cooperation in the region. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at this region itself. So about it, obviously this covers 2 major continents of the globe. We have the North American continent and the South American continent. And obviously the major countries in North America are Canada, United States, and Mexico. We have the Caribbean with a whole range of countries. And then in South America, major countries obviously include Brazil, Colombia, Peru, French New Guinea, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, and the like. And what's really fascinating about this region is that it basically has, shares 2 parts of the world, given that it's on the western side of it. It's buffered by the Pacific Ocean, both the North Pacific and the South Pacific. And on the eastern side, it's buffered by the Atlantic Ocean, both the North and the South Atlantic Oceans. And if we expanded this globe, obviously we know that we'd have to travel all the way around across the Pacific to get to East Asia and Australia and the Oceania region with the Philippines and Indonesia and the like. And if we go across the Atlantic, we're in Europe and in Africa. And so this is like the region that we're looking at. And instead of looking at the bilateral relations or the connections across these oceans, like we did the past 4 weeks of looking at the Pacific and the Atlantic, we're going to look within this hemisphere, the Western, and looking at the Americas as a whole. So with that, let's focus on an example of conflict. And what I'd like to start with in the first week is a historical conflict that occurred in this region. And I wanted to bring up the Mexican-American War because I feel like obviously this kind of is one of many conflicts in the region, but this was defining for both the United States, an emerging country at the time, and Mexico, which was a very expansive nation or country at the time, and then was slowly chipped away at as the United States expanded from the East Coast to the West Coast. And so what we'll do is I'll have this short paragraph, or it's actually pretty long, but I'll have this read to us by the computer and we'll listen in for a bit. So let me go ahead and set that up.
The Mexican-American War, also known in the United States as the Mexican War and in Mexico as the Intervention Estadounidense in Mexico, U.S. Intervention in Mexico, B, was an armed conflict between the United States and Mexico from 1846 to 1848. It followed the 1845 U.S. annexation of Texas, which Mexico considered Mexican territory since the Mexican government did not recognize the Velasco Treaty signed by Mexican General Antonio López de Santa Anna when he was a prisoner of the Texian Army during the 1836 Texas Revolution. The Republic of Texas was de facto an independent country, Most of its citizens wished to be annexed by the United States. 4. Domestic sectional politics in the U.S. were preventing annexation since Texas would have been a slave state, upsetting the balance of power between northern free states and southern slave states. 5. In the 1844 United States presidential election, Democrat James K. Polk was elected on a platform of expanding U.S. territory in Oregon and Texas. Polk advocated expansion by either peaceful means or by armed force, with the 1845 annexation of Texas furthering that goal by peaceful means. 6. However, the boundary between Texas and Mexico was disputed, with the Republic of Texas and the U.S. asserting it to be the Rio Grande River and Mexico claiming it to be the more northern Nueces River. Both Mexico and the U.S. claimed the disputed area and sent troops. Polk sent U.S. Army troops to the area. He also sent a diplomatic mission to Mexico to try to negotiate the sale of territory. U.S. troops' presence was designed to lure Mexico into starting the conflict, putting the onus on Mexico, and allowing Polk to argue to Congress that a declaration of war should be issued. 7. Mexican forces attacked U.S. forces, and the United States Congress declared war. 8.
And so this Wikipedia entry goes on to describe in very painstaking detail the conflict of the Mexican-American War and who was involved, like the commanders and leaders on both sides, what led up to it, the preparations for war in both countries, how the hostilities broke out, the reaction by the U.S. Government and by the general U.S. population, and then basically how the war ended. So we'll just kind of fast forward to that part of the end of war and peace of terms. And basically the victory was in the favor of the United States, and it required a treaty to be signed, in this case, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that was signed in February of 1848. And it basically resulted in the loss of significant territorial gains by the loss of those of the territories by Mexico and gained by the United States. And this fundamentally shaped the path of the United States going forward, because it essentially secured a very large land bridge from the eastern part of the country at the time to the western part of the country at the time, and it served as this unifying force in the United States. It also shaped Mexican politics and dynamics, because it basically was a loss, and it was recognized that way in the Mexican government and with the Mexican within Mexican society. And something like people don't forget that there was an acquiescence to this emerging at the time continental power. And so with these changed territories, it really starts to embed the future nature or relationships between these two countries. So when you think about now where we're at with the United States and Mexico's relationship, obviously there's significant economic trade. More deeply, there's a growing cultural trade or existence. Me personally, having been born in Mexico and then coming here to the United States when I was very young, having many people who are foreign born from Mexico living in the U.S., now having first, second, third generation Mexican Americans. Obviously, there's Mexican Americans who have been here for several generations since they were the original settlers of this region, obviously after the indigenous communities of both the Americas. And just knowing that there's a meshing, right, of these communities, but there's also tension, right? Obviously, two different languages are spoken, English and Spanish. There is historical cooperation along the borders, but obviously there's tension because of both domestic politics, of other trade, of drugs and other things like that. And basically coming down to like part of how the Americas is being shaped now and going forward is this relationship between the United States and Mexico, which we'll talk a little bit more about now and then in a little more detail next week. So this is an example of conflict, right? Two countries having dispute over territory and then it resettling or reshuffling the basically North American continent or the middle North American continent. Now, the second example or the next example I like to look at is cooperation, right? So this conflict was in the 1840s. So what, 170 years ago now? So it's a good chunk of time has passed. And like, where are we at today? So one of the examples of cooperation in the Americas is called the Organization of American States. And I'll go ahead and open this link so we can explore more about the OAS and get a sense of what it is and what it's about. So let me see if the YouTube link is working. I had an issue with it last week.
Ahora pues demos paso.
And let's see what their overview video, they had it. Let me come back to it. Let me go ahead and open up their about page and who they are, and we'll go ahead and have this read to us as well. And what I'll do is I'll change the voice on it because I can do that with my readers. So let me just change the voice options a little bit. It's a way of mixing it up a bit. So let's get to that. Okay.
Organization of American States is the world's oldest regional organization, dating back to the First International Conference of American States, held in Washington, D.C., from October 1889 to April 1890. That meeting approved the establishment of the International Union of American Republics, and the stage was set for the weaving of a web of provisions and institutions that came to be known as the Inter-American System, the oldest international institutional system. The OAS came into being in 1948 with the signing in Bogota, Colombia, of the Charter of the OAS, which entered into force in December 1951. It was subsequently amended by the Protocol of Buenos Aires, signed in 1967, which entered into force in February 1970, by the Protocol of Cartagena de Indias, signed in 1985, which entered into force in November 1988, by the Protocol of Managua, signed in 1993, which entered into force in January 1996, and by the Protocol of Washington, signed in 1992, which entered into force in September 1997. The organization was established in order to achieve among its member states, as stipulated in Article 1 of the Charter, an order of peace and justice, to promote their solidarity, to strengthen their collaboration, and to defend their sovereignty, their territorial integrity, and their independence. Today, the OAS brings together all 35 independent states of the Americas and constitutes the main political, juridical, and social governmental forum in the hemisphere. In addition, it has granted permanent observer status to 69 states, as well as to the European Union, EU. The organization uses a four-pronged approach to effectively implement its essential purposes, based on its main pillars: democracy, human rights, security, and development.
So there you get a sense of what the Organization of American States is. And I think there's just three things I like to point out. First is that it's rooted in a late 1800s agreement. And just know that that was less than 50 years after that Mexican-American War. So the United States, as well as other countries in the hemisphere, saw an interest in trying to bring people together to promote cooperation at some level. But it wasn't for another 50, 60 years or so until the OAS came into existence. And note the year that it came about was 1948. And some of you who are historians and astute observers of the United States politics and of history, like, you'll know that that's right after World War II and the beginnings of the Cold War between the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialists, or the USSR or the Soviet Union. And so this was a part of the United States' efforts to maintain presence, influence, control in this part of the world, obviously as a buttress against any influences from other powers, particularly the Soviet Union. Now, the other thing I like to point out is the organizational chart, just to kind of get a visual sense of this region and of the work they do, or of this international organization. And organizational charts for me are always helpful because it just is like, oh, okay, I can see what's going on. So I wanted to highlight a couple of things here. First is that they have this General Assembly, right, which is all the member countries are able to have representatives at that body, helping to shape things. And part of the work that the General Assembly does is organize into specialized organizations, organize conferences, commissions, committees, consultation groups, permanent council, and things like that. And they're all being supported by a general secretariat, which is like the bureaucratic or the administrative arm that helps to implement any of these policy, either the charter, the policies, procedures, regulations, or efforts that are trying to be facilitated. And within any entities and agencies associated with the General Assembly and the General Secretariat, there's a whole bunch of different commissions and or committees that are working on specific things like drug abuse, or committees against terrorism, or justice studies, or natural disaster, or defense. And just know that the Organization of American States is a very sophisticated body, just like any other international institutional organization. And while they have members countries and obviously observers, as was mentioned, which are other countries that can just send their representatives and listen to what's going on, obviously be a part of a dialogue, but not decision-making authority, really is the power of cooperation, right? Bringing people together into a common space to have the ability to communicate, the ability to coordinate action that is needed to be taken at some multiple level, and the ability to cooperate is a very powerful set of elements that international organizations are able to facilitate. And so we here have like a very meaningful example of an organization that is shaping the region of the Americas and the politics of the Americas. And what's just so exciting about it all is that if you want to engage more or learn more, that they have opportunities for folks to work, to do internships. And I'll just pull out their last thing, their locations. Their main headquarters is in Washington, D.C. And, say you were transferred to State University, or you go to UC, they have DC study programs or education programs that you can participate in. And maybe one of the places you want to intern is the Organization of American States. So hopefully get a sense that this is a very clear example of cooperation, this international institution. Now, last thing another example of cooperation that I won't spend too much time on, I'll just briefly mention, is called Mercosur. And I'll go ahead and open up their webpage. You might be asking, okay, so OAS is like governmental member countries focused on a range of things. What's Mercosur? And I'll go ahead and have this these few paragraphs play. So I'm gonna go ahead and highlight it, and we'll have it go.
What is Mercosur? The Southern Common Market, Mercosur for its Spanish initials, is a regional integration process, initially established by Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, and subsequently joined by Venezuela and Bolivia*, the latter still complying with the accession procedure. Its official working languages are Spanish and Portuguese. The working document's official version will be that of the host country language of each meeting. As of 2006, through the decision CMC No. 3506, Guarani was incorporated as one of the languages of the bloc. Mercosur is an open and dynamic process. Since its creation, its main objective has been to promote a common space that generates business and investment opportunities through the competitive integration of national economies into the international market. As a result, it has established multiple agreements with countries or groups of countries, granting them, in some cases, the status of associated states, this being the situation of the South American countries. These participate in activities and meetings of the bloc and have trade preferences with the states' parties. Mercosur has also signed commercial, political, or cooperation agreements with a diverse number of nations and organizations on all 5 continents.
So there you get a sense that this is functionally a trading bloc, right? It's about bringing countries together to help facilitate trade, business, and other economic transactions. And note that this doesn't specifically include the United States, right? That it was formed by nations on the South American continent. And this is helpful because it basically demonstrates that leadership can be exercised by any country. It isn't just US centric. And typically, because we either living or studying in the US, like we're always thinking like what US's role is in everything. But in reality, that countries, both large and small, rich and poor, in different parts of the world, they're doing their own thing. Right, they're organizing, they're mobilizing, they're having communication, they're having political talks, economic talks, trade talks, climate talks, and the like. So it's a very dynamic community, and it isn't just shaped or led by the United States. So one last thing I just point out is this implication slide. I'll let you explore it further. It's basically an article that talks about how Brazil and Argentina agree to a framework to lower Mercosur tariffs. And you might be asking, what's a tariff? Well, basically, a tariff is like it's a tax you have to pay to either import a good or export a good into import a good from another country. And so that makes exports from your country higher because the people who you're going to send it to in another country have to pay more. And so this happened just about a week ago, where these two major countries, Brazil and Argentina, agreed to say, okay, let's find a way to lower those taxes so that it doesn't cost as much for businesses to sell it and for people to buy it. And this is just an example of how a body that brings folks together to have a dialogue is able to have tangible, or at least the framework for tangible results, right? So if Brazil is going to export something to Argentina, Argentinians don't have to pay as much for it because the tariffs have been reduced or minimized in some way. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop the recording and move us to the discussion. Thanks for taking the time to listen in, and look forward to seeing you at another workshop. So take care.